Bienvenidos a esta entrevista que TV UNAM hace al doctor Paul Krugman. Como ustedes saben, se trata de un premio Nobel en Economía, pero el profesor Krugman, que fue profesor por muchos años de la Universidad de Princeton, sigue haciendo su tarea docente en la Universidad de la Ciudad de Nueva York, es más que un economista. Él aborda los grandes temas. En esta ocasión trataremos de enfocar temas que interesan a México y a Estados Unidos. La crisis de Estados Unidos y la crisis en las relaciones con México. Professor Krugman, it's really a pleasure to have you here in Mexico again, and we thank you on behalf of the National University TV station. And if you don't mind, we can start this discussion talking about Mexico and the United States.
Okay.
And one way of approaching is right now the free trade agreement that is in danger.
Right.
After 23 years in existence. It seems that President Trump don't like, and will never like this NAFTA business. There is one thing that is very peculiar for us. Several times Trump said that NAFTA is the worst trade agreement that the US signed in its history, and that Mexico took advantage of the United States. It's very peculiar for us because a small country taking advantage of the United States is not very often said. But to what an extent there is a real grievance in the United States about NAFTA?
Well, there's very little, certainly nothing Trump says should be taken seriously, intellectually. Nothing he says should be taken as indicating any of the real problems. I think if you were going, and it's clear he doesn't understand what NAFTA does, how it works, any of that. I think there were two issues if you're taking a parochial United States point of view on NAFTA. There are two issues. One is that Mexico runs a trade surplus with the United States. It's not large, but it is a surplus, and to the extent that you worry that there is sometimes a bit of a problem with the US trade deficit, usually it's not a big problem, but sometimes it is, then NAFTA may contribute. Now, that's really the reason Mexico runs a trade surplus is this is all a legacy of the financial crisis of '95 here, and that led to somewhat depressed investment. So there is some trade imbalance. It's not a big one, but there is some trade imbalance. The other is that Mexico does, it exports labor-intensive goods to the United States, imports capital-intensive, skill-intensive goods, and that trade may contribute a little bit to income inequality in the United States. So there are a couple of issues. They're really not big issues. As these things go, NAFTA shouldn't be high on anyone's list of concerns for the United States. Certainly not the worst trade agreement anybody's ever signed, nothing like that. It would be, but I think you have to be honest, it's not completely problem-free. But on the other hand, it's very deeply embedded in both of our economies now. The idea that you could say, okay, NAFTA's bad, let's destroy it, it's completely crazy, totally destructive, which means, of course, Trump might actually do it.
Professor Krugman, there is another side to this issue, something that you touch in your own view of the United States. Yeah. You are, time and again, you said that the racial issue is always there in the US.
Yeah.
And recently, I think that it was last week, your column on Puerto Rico, you said that the reaction of Washington, of Trump especially, was not particularly positive, and you wonder what could have been that reaction if Puerto Ricans were not Latinos,
Right.
but of Scandinavian descent.
That's right.
Mexico used to have, the Mexican government used to have a very good relationship with the United States during the Cold War. Mexico was not a democracy, but the US was very pleased with the kind of political system. Everything was in order in Mexico. It was very useful for the Cold War. Now, it seems, at least it seems to me, that Mexico is very useful for Trump exactly in the opposite side. Mexico is NAFTA and trade deficit. Mexico is drugs, crime, rapists, and many other things. Is there also, in your view, this very profound issue of race in this Mexican-US relationship?
Well, yes. I mean, clearly, race, nothing in U.S. politics can be understood without race. Race is central. Now, it starts, of course, as black-white, but it extends to other ethnicities as well. And there's an interesting question, why do some ethnic groups become white, as we say, while others do not? So nobody in the United States now thinks of the Irish as being, alien foreigners who can't be trusted, although they used to. If you go back a century, there were a lot of people who did think that way. Very few people think that about Italians. Others, well, I am the descendant of Russian Jews, and we are finding out that maybe we're not white either. The anti-Semitism still turns out to be a significant force in America. So, but definitely, now it's not necessarily, you have to say that the callousness of the Trump administration, its willingness to ignore people in trouble, to some extent goes beyond. You don't have to be Hispanic to be neglected. We've just had these terrible fires in Northern California,
yes,
and Trump has said not one word about that disaster, which tells you he's perfectly capable of ignoring a human catastrophe, even in a white part of the United States. But there is something. Mexico is alien. It speaks a different language. On average, the people are a little bit darker than Donald Trump, and all of that hurts. Now, what's really peculiar or distressing is that if we actually think of what were the political goals of NAFTA from the point of view of the United States, what did the U.S. want from NAFTA? Because it was a political agreement as much as an economic agreement.
Yes.
What we wanted was to encourage reformists in Mexico. We wanted to encourage democratic forces in Mexico. We hoped for, great things in the Mexican economy, but above all, it was about producing a Mexico that was closer in democratic values to those that the United States, we thought, believed in. And on all of those dimensions, it has been successful. Mexico is much more of a democracy than it was in the bad old days. It's not a one-party state. It has been friendly and cooperative with the United States on many issues, including crime and drugs. But exactly at the moment when Mexico ought to be the kind of country the United States has a firm alliance with, that's exactly the moment when Trump and people like Trump go crazy.
You were very positive about the future of the United States, and I suppose that even the world before Trump.
Yeah.
You said that you were looking time and again at New Deal, at Roosevelt, and the creation of this welfare state that is on economic grounds as well as on moral grounds, what the U.S. should strive to achieve. Right now, it seems that the world is, at least the United States, and probably part of the world, going the other way around. What is your view about the future? of this kind of, not utopia, but close to a utopia, and income distribution. You are very worried always about income distribution that was becoming very unequal.
Right. So first things to say is a lot of the things I was optimistic about, not all of them, but a lot of them actually did happen. Under Obama, we had a tremendous improvement in our healthcare system. Not perfect, but we basically added 20 million people to 20 million more people got health insurance, and they were the people who needed it most. We actually did make some significant progress in making the tax system fairer. We raised taxes on the wealthy and used it to provide crucial benefits for the poor. So we made substantial progress. And even with Trump, it's turning out to be harder to reverse that progress than a lot of people think, right? Republicans tried to repeal Obamacare, and Trump is now, having failed, he's now trying to destroy it through sabotage, and even that may be failing. You know, as we speak, earlier today, it appears that Congress agreed on measures that will undo what Trump just tried to do. So it appears that we made significant progress in making the system fairer under Obama, in spite of the limitations. Now, what is true is that there turn out to be darker forces in the United States, or the dark forces are stronger than I realized. And it's not just the United States. I mean, we've had a series of political successes for essentially fascist parties in Europe. All of that is there. Now, it's not a majority. Remember, Trump lost the popular vote. And right now, you know, we have, next year we'll have a congressional election in the United States. It's almost certain that Democrats will receive more votes than Republicans, but because of the peculiar way our system is set up, that probably won't mean that they actually take control of the House of Representatives. So in a way, what we're having is we have an angry racist minority in the country, and a political system which is set up in such a way that that minority holds disproportionate political power. So sure, the world is turning out to be rougher than I thought it was, and I think nobody knows. You know, if we'd been sitting in 1938 looking at the world, you would have been very depressed.
Yes.
And by 1958, it was an incredibly better place than anyone could have imagined. And I hope that's what we're sitting. I don't know that. For all I know, things could get far, far worse.
You are not losing hope.
No, I don't give up hope. I don't. But the main thing is you just keep on trying. You don't say, oh my God, the world is doomed. You know, you do what you can, and there have been enough successes that, and there have been enough times, if I can say. I remember the way many of us felt in 2004, after Bush was reelected, thinking there was no hope for progressive causes, and that turned out not to be true. So, you know, the world in 2021 may look very, very different from the world right now.
Now, this issue of income distribution, wealth concentration that is taking place in the United States as well as in Mexico. Here, a colleague of mine just produced a paper, a small paper, a year ago, proving that for families here, the wealth of these four families amount to 8 point something of the gross national product. Yeah. That's a brutal concentration. The US is also in that way. How come these two countries so different, one rich, the other poor, one democratic, the other not so democratic, are ending in the same place in regard to income distribution?
Well, for a couple of things. One is Mexico has been extremely unequal for a very long time, and in fact is a little bit less unequal now, a little bit, than it was at the peak. It got quite a lot, you know, inequality widened a lot between in 1980 and maybe 2000, and then may have come down some. There's been a little bit of progress, so it's not as if things always get worse. And look, there are powerful dynamics that tend to make capitalist societies become more unequal unless there are strong policy measures taken to oppose that. Capital tends to concentrate in the hands of a few people unless you have taxation, inheritance taxes. Workers tend to have limited bargaining power unless you have unions. Thomas Piketty had this famous book arguing, one way to read his book is one of saying that the normal state of capitalist economies is one of extreme inequality, and only on rare occasions following dramatic policy changes, typically following big wars, do they become relatively equal. And that may be the case, but we can, I think we can see that there is some ability to fight it. The United States among wealthy countries is uniquely unequal. That in a way is saying, oh my God, what's wrong with America? But on the other hand, it's saying that being as unequal as America is not a necessary feature of a modern economy. Denmark is as much a part of the global economy as the United States, but it's a much more equal society than the United States. So that tells you that it can be done, and then the task is one of long, slow, constant, more political struggle than anything else to move in the right direction.
Okay, more political.
Right.
The economy by its nature, the capitalist economy by its nature, tend to be to favor this inequality of in income distribution and other similar things. But then how do you explain that your country right now has as the political basis of Trump a big chunk of relatively poor people that should be supporting a very different policy? They are how can I say, in objective terms, they should be looking for another policy, very different.
I take a look at, I take one particular state I like to use to think about this, which is West Virginia. West Virginia voted for Trump by 40 percentage points. It's a very poor state.
Yes.
It receives lots of aid from the federal government. It's completely dependent upon programs that Republicans want to kill. The population gets its health care from Medicare and Medicaid. A fifth of the population is on food stamps. The jobs, 15% of the jobs are in health and social assistance. Who do you think pays for that? It's actually Washington federal aid, and yet they vote for this right-wing Republican. A couple of things. One is race, as always. It's a very white state, and they think even though they themselves receive these programs, they don't think of it. When you say government programs, they think that means giving money to black people or Hispanic people, and are shocked when you say, by the way, or don't believe you when you say, your Medicare, that's a government program. And there's cultural issues. They feel alienated from the educated elite. That's almost perfectly bound up with the racism. And partly they were lied to. Trump in the campaign said, I will not cut your, no one will lose health insurance. I will not cut Medicare. I will, he pretended to be an economic populist, and because culturally, racially, he seemed to be their kind of guy, they believed him. And I think we're just starting to see a little bit of waking up now. But a lot of people are going to be very reluctant to see it. We have a term. I learned something. Remember Bernie Madoff, the great swindler, and how did he convince so many people to trust him?
Pyramid business.
The term I learned is something called affinity fraud, which is someone who seems like you, seems like your kind of person, is often very effective at swindling you. In his case, actually, it was Jewish New Yorkers who thought that he was like them. But in this case, a big white guy who talks tough and sneers at elites seems to people, to working class white people, like their kind of guy. Mm-hmm. And it takes a while for them to be convinced that he is in fact swindling them, and that's what happened.
So the next political energy that is going to stop Trump and many Trumps in this world, it will come from where? If it's not this kind of people that objectively are really being trashed by the modern economy, look at Mexico or Latin America. Where can we hope?
Well, of course, the answer to that is I don't really know. If I was much more optimistic than I should have been about the United States. What I actually, let me tell you what I thought was going to happen in last year in America and did not, which was that we were going to actually, that the voting bloc that was really going to turn heavily was educated women. To be honest, it turns out that on voting, there's a very peculiar thing in the United States. If you look at by income, the richer people are, the more Republican they are. Mm-hmm. If we look at people by education, which we can separate from income, the more educated they are, the more Democratic they are. And I thought that we were going to get enough women who are liberated in important ways by being educated, by being an economy, a society that is less sexist than it was, that they were going to change it. And the other thing is actually shifting demography. The United States was a country where there were only two kinds of people. There were whites and there were blacks. We're now a country where there's whites, there's Hispanics, there's Asians, and that the growing numbers of the other minority groups will eventually swing the balance. I still think that is probably true, but I have to admit that I'm worried that too many votes may be suppressed.
There are among some colleagues of mine the idea that Trump can be a little helpful in making Mexico going in a different way, because NAFTA was not the answer that they promised us to be. That once we are in NAFTA, the road to development was more or less clear, and we have been there for 23 years, and the Mexican economy is not growing, but a modest way, 2.5% per year. If we left NAFTA, do you think that it's possible to find another, if we left or we are just said goodbye, it was good to be with you, and what is the possibility of a...
No, and now, one has to start by saying that the growth payoff to NAFTA, and actually even before NAFTA, Mexico really opened itself up to the world economy beginning under Salinas, 85 to 88, and NAFTA just took that further. And the economy was transformed. Mexico used to be oil and tourism and sold nothing else. Now it's a huge manufacturing center, but somehow that has not produced the kind of overall economic growth one wants. Now, admitting that, there's no reason to believe that turning back inwards is going to do any better. There were reasons why the whole, the former path of development of it was a dead end. It wasn't going anywhere. So I think what you need to do is you need to ask, what are the things that holds Mexico back? And those are hard. It's hard to deal with. We don't know. education is still an issue, and I'm told, I'm not an expert, I'm told that the educational story is improving, not great, but improving. But of course, that takes 20 years to show up in the economy.
Yes.
Infrastructure is better, but not as good as it should be. Crime is a serious issue. Corruption is a serious issue. So there are all of these fronts on which Mexico needs to move. I don't think that turning your back on NAFTA, turning your back on, more generally, on international trade offers any plausible way forward. But if anyone has a good, interesting idea about how to make Mexico grow like South Korea,
Exactly.
but no one knows how to do that. No, and I'm not.
That is the aim.
Yes, we all want Mexico to be South Korea. I'm not sure the South Koreans are entirely happy with where they are, but it's vastly better. And and nobody, if there were any voices in the political debate in Mexico saying anything that sounded like a way to do that, or even to move significantly down that route, I'd be very interested to hear it. But at least from what I can read, and I read not a word of Spanish, but from what I can read, I don't see that. One other thing to say, making Mexico rich is hard. We don't really know how to do it. There are a bunch of things you can try. Making Mexico's poor a little bit less poor, that we do know how to do. So you don't want to only think about how do we make Mexico a wealthy country, although that's clearly the objective. You also want to say, how do we make life more tolerable?
Yes.
Meanwhile.
Yes. You said several times in your book of Conscience of a Liberal and many other things, that if we have in the US, or I suppose anywhere in the world, a system that is less unequal will also help the economy. You said the New Deal and what comes after the New Deal was not the closing of opportunities for economic growth. Quite the contrary. It was a boom in many ways.
Now, there are colleagues of mine who are convinced that a big reduction in inequality will actually lead to a big increase in growth, who are sure, and I hope they're right. I mean, and these are we're not talking about foolish people, we're talking about great economists. So my friend Joseph Stiglitz
Yes.
but very much believes this. I'm a little skeptical about it. I think largely because I don't, if I can say it's because I want to believe it. And so if there's something I want to believe, I make a real effort not to believe it until I'm completely convinced. So I would love to believe that reducing inequality would be great for growth. But what we know for sure from the evidence is that reducing inequality doesn't hurt growth. You don't see any sign at all that countries that take actions to reduce inequality undermine their economic growth. The New Deal in the United States was followed by a generation of excellent economic performance. Many European countries with very strong welfare states like Denmark and Sweden have very successful economies. You just don't see that there's any cost. And meanwhile, life is better for most people in such economies. So if you ask the question, which would you rather be? You're going to be born as a random citizen of, country A or country B. Would you rather be a random citizen of the United States or a random citizen of Denmark or France? He said, well, GDP per capita is a bit higher in the United States, but the condition, if you should happen to end up being poor,
Yes.
or even just in the bottom half of the income distribution, life is enormously better if you're in one of these countries that has guaranteed health care, guaranteed maternity leave, all of these things that the United States fails to provide. So I'm not a terrific enthusiast for the view that reducing inequality is the key to economic success. It might be. We don't know that for sure. But it certainly is the key to making life much better for lots of people, and there's no visible cost.
Because in the case of Mexico, somebody will say, well, inequality is a problem. But also we should be looking at other countries, other places, because to concentrate your exports in the United States, 80%.
Yeah.
Being the United States so powerful, being your country so powerless, it's not a good idea to be so close in geographical terms, so close in economic terms, and unable to have an input really in this relationship. When somebody said in Washington, enough is enough, we don't like NAFTA, we don't like you, goodbye, good luck. We should be looking at other possibilities beyond NAFTA.
Well, you should certainly look for them. I mean, the trade deals, economic cooperation, wherever you can find it is a good thing. Now, I have to say, we know there's a very strong statistical relationship in trade, which we call the gravity equation, which says that other things being the same, the amount of trade between two countries falls off with distance. It's almost inversely proportional. But anyway, the point is that the fact that Mexico is here and the United States is here means that you're going to be doing most of your trade with the United States. That's very close to being a law of nature. It's very hard to fight that. And it is in some important ways a significant resource of Mexico. I mean, when you ask what does Mexico have that China does not have? Well, one thing Mexico has is the ability, if there's an immediate demand for something in Chicago, you can put it on a truck in Monterrey, and it can be in Chicago 36 hours later, and you can't do that from Beijing or Shanghai. There's always going, unless the United States goes crazy, which unfortunately is a possibility, there's always going to be a strong relationship between the Mexican and the U.S. economies. Canada also is very heavily dependent on the United States just because it's there. But by all means, they should certainly not think of NAFTA as the only vehicle. There should be agreements with the European Union. There should be agreements with the rising powers of Asia.
And somebody can suggest that rethinking the role of the state, that the state can direct or redirect resources, priorities, that in this economy of today in which the market is supreme, is the king, and the state should almost disappear. Well, Reagan was the one that said that the problem was the government.
That's right.
What is the role of the state? What could be a good role of the state in this capitalist global economy?
So I'm very much in the middle ground there, right? Central planning, state-run economies, that's a dead end. We know that doesn't work. Complete laissez-faire, no state, we're seeing very strongly the problems with that as well. Now the trouble is there's a very big middle ground in there. And so clearly the government there are a lot of services that the government must provide. Even aside from social welfare, the government has to provide infrastructure, communications, water, legal environment. And in fact, all of those things, we talk about industrial policy and whether the government should actually try to dictate the industries.
Yes.
Well, a heavy-handed industrial policy is almost certainly a mistake, but there's a lot of things the government can't do unless it's going to at least make some guesses about which industries are going to expand. So you have to have at least an industrial vision with some flexibility, knowing that you might be wrong, but pushing certain sectors, research, development, seed money. I know, well, look, the United States, we were talking about Obama. One of the things that we don't talk about nearly enough is that under Obama, there was actually quite a lot of government investment in the energy sector, in the new energy sector, in solar, in wind, in clean technologies. And by and large, that investment has been very successful. There were a couple of companies that went bankrupt, but private sector has companies that go bankrupt too. And if we look at it overall, it was remarkable. We had a multi-fold increase in renewable energy production. We have reached a point now where a lot of that is probably irreversible. Even if Trump tries to kill it, it will continue to grow, which tells you that there is some room. Now, you don't want to do it too far. You don't want to say, okay, these are the 5 industries, and we will have a 5-year plan, and we will make these 5 industries grow. No government knows enough to do that, but certainly have some role of planning, guidance, encouragement. That's an appropriate role of government.
Because South Korea has a strong government and
although
a kind of planning.
Yeah, although their record is more complicated than I've been around for a while, and I remember in the 80s, South Korea did have a fairly heavy-handed industrial policy push, which turned out to be all wrong. They were all focused on heavy industry. They wanted steel, and and it turned out that the future of South Korea, a lot of it turned out to be in things like electronics, which the government wasn't thinking of at all. So they got what South Korea has done is they've always had an environment that helped to funnel capital to companies that seem to be contributing to the economy. They've not had a religious commitment to hands off, the government does nothing. But never, when the government tried to plan things too closely, they screwed up just like anybody else. We're all human. Governments are imperfect.
Yes. Especially if there is a lot of corruption in government.
Right.
I think that's an element that tends to disrupt everything the government tries to do.
Yeah. Would you like an industrial policy in Mexico that ends up being done all for the benefit of those 4 families that own so much wealth, right? That's so you have to have checks and balances and limits, because otherwise it has been. We've seen all of these stories have happened somewhere, and we've seen successful industrial policies, we've seen unsuccessful, we've seen ones that are administered pretty honestly, we've seen ones that are hopelessly corrupt, and it's more in the details of trying to get it right and being flexible, being open-minded.
The details more than the big plan and the big idea.
That's right.
There is no room right now for a new utopia like socialism, like Marxism. We don't know where the world is going on.
No, I mean, if you even try to think, I mean, we're all very focused now on exciting new technologies. Which of them are going to actually, be successful and play out? Is it all going to be self-driving cars? Is it all, so things have a way of surprising you. The government can play a role in making it easier for things to happen, but they can happen in directions that nobody anticipated.
Yeah, surprise. There is always the element, but sometimes that surprise, like with Trump, is a very
the world
very peculiar surprise.
I'm not a big fan of Margaret Thatcher, but I do like one quote. She says, "Why do people always expect surprises to be positive?"
Yeah,
they often are not.
Now let's go back to your country. What is the immediate future of the United States? You said it, the U.S. is, to a certain extent, in crisis, in political crisis, not in economic crisis.
No, although, if an economic crisis should happen, suppose something serious goes wrong. Suppose there's something like 2008 or whatever. Do you really want the people who've been handling the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico to be handling the aftermath of a crisis for the U.S. economy? It's hard to think of a less competent group of people than we have in the White House. So far, that hasn't mattered, but I worry things will go wrong. So right now, the economy is sort of humming along on momentum, but who knows what happens next.
For a while, the Middle East was viewed as the big problem for the United States.
Right.
And from the United States, it was viewed as a problem. Right now, the Middle East is somehow out of the radar of the U.S.
Yes, but not...
Now is Korea.
Well, yes.
That is a very small, tiny country.
But when I was growing up, people used to say one nuclear bomb can ruin your whole day. I mean, no one would care at all about Korea except for the nuclear weapons. Well, two things, actually, nuclear weapons and the fact that it is right next door to South Korea, which is a much more important country, and half the population lives within artillery range of the North Korean border. So Korea could be very, very nasty. And on the Middle East, it's not as if things are okay in the Middle East. It's just that
No.
we have limited attention, and we...
It seems that President Trump is just not looking at the Middle East and allowed it to go...
There's business with Iran. He's managed to find a way to not actually break an agreement, but at the same time make the United States seem unreliable. So this is kind of a innovative solution, if I might say, but not in a good way.
But the big issue is China. How do you see the relationship between the U.S. and this big, huge China that is now out of that century of darkness and complete chaos? Now is something to...
Well, yeah. So I do worry still that the Chinese economy may have a nasty correction. Now, I've been saying this for about 5 years, and it keeps not happening, but their economy is extremely unbalanced. They have very, very high investment with low returns, not enough consumption. It's not too hard to tell a story. I guess in some ways I say that the Chinese economy looks like Japan did in the late 1980s, just before it had its big bubble and crash, with the difference being that Japan is a very cohesive society that handled the crisis pretty well, and China is probably not. So I worry that China may have a crash coming. Still, no question that China is, first of all, huge and incredibly vigorous, and is reaching out into the world. I was there, not a few weeks ago, and just the scale of everything. Everything is brand new and it's enormous, and you just say this does kind of look like the future, and we have not yet figured out what role it plays. The United States emerged as a superpower. It had the power, but it also had a value system that was universal. We often failed to live up to our own principles, but nonetheless, the United States did have some ideas. It could say, we are for democracy, we are for justice, we are for equality, we are for global rule of law. So we knew what a Pax Americana looked like. What does a Pax Seneca, when China doesn't really seem to stand for anything except China, how does that work?
Well, we have to end this conversation, but I don't want to leave just like that. You are at the end positive about the future.
Well, first of all, if it's as bad as I sometimes fear, then what's the point of worrying about that? If it happens, it happens. So that's a terrible way to say it. But look, there's I don't know. In my own country, what always strikes me is how decent most people are as individuals. Not everybody, obviously, not Trump, not Harvey Weinstein, right? There are definitely there are evil men in the world, and I don't think I fully appreciated just how evil some men are until recently. But most people are not. Most people are actually reasonably generous. You know, when we talk about race and when we talk about immigration issues, if we look across the United States, we ask, which are the places that are most hostile to immigrants and which are the places that are most favorable towards immigrants? And it turns out the places that are most hostile to immigrants are the ones where there are almost no immigrants.
Yes.
And the places that have lots of immigrants, like New York or New Jersey, people start to see them as people like themselves. And so that gives me hope. That makes me think that we may have salvation in the end.
Thank you very, very much.
Well, thank you.
Professor Krugman, it was a pleasure, and I hope that you enjoy your stay in Mexico.
I am hoping to, expecting to. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot. Como ustedes podrán ver, la variedad de asuntos que se tocaron, hay uno que destaca en particular. Es la sorpresa que una persona como Krugman, muy conocedor, por cierto, de la historia de su país, de la historia no solo económica, sino de la historia social, se llevó cuando en las últimas elecciones el candidato republicano alcanzó la victoria. No esperaba, desde luego no solamente el profesor Krugman, no lo esperaba casi nadie dentro y fuera de Estados Unidos, la victoria de Donald Trump. Krugman ha sido uno de los críticos más sistemáticos y duros con Trump. Es una crítica muy bien hecha. Está basada básicamente en su conocimiento de la economía y de la sociedad norteamericana. Después de la Guerra Civil de Estados Unidos, había habido una enorme etapa de crecimiento económico, pero con una tremenda concentración del poder económico, del ingreso. La Gran Depresión, la presidencia del presidente Roosevelt, la Segunda Guerra Mundial, llevó a que Estados Unidos cambiara enormemente su sistema político y sobre todo la dirección hacia donde iba ese sistema político. A partir de la Segunda Guerra Mundial hay un crecimiento de la clase media, hay una redistribución muy positiva del ingreso. Sin embargo, ya para los años 70, Krugman detecta una casi inevitable concentración otra vez del ingreso. Casi se vuelve al siglo XIX al finalizar el siglo XX. El esfuerzo intelectual y político, porque Krugman es un intelectual público, en ese sentido es un político, su esfuerzo es señalar que este tipo de economía, o más bien el resultado de esta economía en materia de concentración del ingreso y desigualdad social, va en contra posiblemente del propio crecimiento económico de Estados Unidos y desde luego en contra de las bases éticas y morales de ese país. Se puede traducir al ambiente mexicano. Es exactamente la misma dinámica. Viendo las estadísticas a nivel mundial y comparándolas, encontramos que tanto México como Estados Unidos están en ese extremo de los países con mayor desigualdad. Krugman es un campeón de la idea de que los sistemas políticos tienen que tener una actitud hacia las grandes concentraciones de la riqueza pues más dura, para poder emparejar en algo el nivel del suelo en el que se mueven las economías que naturalmente tienden a la desigualdad. Él, como muchos de nosotros, no sabe exactamente qué es lo que guarda el futuro para nuestros respectivos países y para el mundo, pero tiene al final, como se pudo apreciar en la entrevista, un final, digamos, positivo. Considera que de alguna manera un sistema político democrático puede llegar a producir los contrapesos para que en este siglo ya no se siga abriendo la brecha entre los muy ricos, las clases medias y los muy pobres, y haya un mundo, pues si no ideal, menos mal del que tenemos. Y yo les recomiendo que en la medida en que puedan, sigan a Paul Krugman en sus artículos y en sus twitters. Y me despido de ustedes.